On October 12, 2025, the sea crashed inland, surging nearly 60 miles up Alaska's flat Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. Overnight, entire villages like Kipnuk and Kwigillingok faced water 6 feet higher than ever recorded, homes floating off their foundations, and barely a day's warning. 60 miles inland, Halong's wake isn't just about a storm. It's about why this disaster didn't end at the coast, and what it means for the future of life on the Delta. How did a typhoon halfway around the world overwhelm entire communities so far from the sea? The answer starts with everyday life on ground barely above water. From above, the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta stretches out in a patchwork of water and land, a place where the river braids and the tundra seem endless. Bethel, Kipnuk, Kwigillingok, and Napakiak are just a handful of the villages scattered across this low-lying plain, each set on ground that barely rises above the highest tides. There are no highways here. Boats and bush planes are the arteries of daily life. In summer, families move along wooden boardwalks built over spongy earth, carrying fish to drying racks and firewood to their homes. In winter, snow machines trace frozen paths between houses and the river. Children walk to school across narrow planks, sometimes balancing in rubber boots, their breath hanging in the cold air. The boardwalks are more than walkways. They are lifelines, connecting homes, clinics, and the only store. When the river overflows or the tide runs high, water laps directly beneath these planks. In some places, the ground is so flat that a single foot of extra water can turn yards into lakes and roads into rivers. Most homes sit just a few feet above sea level, with nothing but soft tundra between doorsteps and the vast Bering Sea. For generations, families here have relied on the land and water for food. Salmon, blackfish, and waterfowl fill drying racks in the short, bright summer. Elders teach children how to read the river's mood, how to spot the signs of a change in weather by the wind or the shape of the clouds. Yet, the same geography that supports this way of life also leaves it exposed. With no hills to block the wind or slow the water, storms can travel far, carrying the sea deep inland. Evacuating isn't simple. A rising river can cut off the only airstrip, and floodwaters can sweep over the boardwalks before families have time to gather more than a few essentials. In this place, the difference between safety and danger is measured in inches of water and hours of warning. Every daily routine, walking to school, hauling fish, visiting a neighbor, happens in the shadow of this vulnerability. The story of what happened here begins with the land itself, a place where the river meets the sea, and where the flatness of the delta turns a distant storm into a local crisis. Typhoon Halong's story began far from Alaska, forming as a tropical depression south of Iwo Jima on October 4th. Within days, it gathered strength over the warm waters of the Western Pacific, reaching Category 4 intensity as it moved north. But the real turning point came as Halong lost its tropical structure and merged with a powerful jet stream east of Japan. By October 10th, the storm had become an extratropical cyclone, its core cooling, but its reach expanding. Meteorologists at the National Weather Service tracked this transformation closely. The Bering Sea was unusually warm for October, with surface temperatures more than a degree Celsius above average. At the same time, sea ice was nearly absent, leaving nothing to slow the storm's progress or absorb its energy. As Halong's remnants raced northeast, the jet stream acted like a conveyor belt, accelerating the storm and steering it directly toward western Alaska. Forecast models began to shift east on October 8th, narrowing their spread and pointing to the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta as the likely target. But this change came late. For villages on the Delta, the window between warning and impact was compressed to less than 24 hours. Rick Tomon, a climate specialist with the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy, explained that the combination of a record-warm North Pacific and open water in the Bering Sea gave Halong a late-season boost. We expect these storms to lose steam as they move north, but this time, the ocean handed Halong extra fuel. The absence of sea ice meant nothing stood between the storm and the low-lying coast. As Halong's wind field widened, it pushed a surge of water far inland, reaching areas that had never seen ocean flooding before. NWS meteorologists later noted that the eastward shift in the storm's track only became clear after new satellite and upper air data fed into the models. By then, the Delta's communities were already facing a race against time. The warnings that reached Bethel, Kipnuk, and Kwigillingok late on October 11th left residents with only hours to prepare. The science behind Halong's path, warm seas, lost ice, a fast jet, explains how a storm born thousands of miles away could send the ocean 60 miles inland, turning a distant typhoon into a local disaster almost overnight. Just after sunrise, in Kipnuk and Kwigillingok, water surged past every familiar marker. In Kipnuk, the flood gauge read 6.6 feet above the highest tide ever recorded. In Kwigillingok, it reached 6.3 feet. This was not a slow, creeping rise. The surge arrived with the force of a river, driven by winds that topped 100 miles per hour. At times, gusts neared 107. Boardwalks that families had walked for generations vanished beneath churning water. Homes, built on pilings sunk into the soft tundra, groaned and shifted. Some began to float, breaking free from their foundations. Inside, families scrambled to move elders and children to higher bunks or kitchen counters, clutching boots and radios. One teenager, phone in hand, filmed as the floor tilted beneath her. Her voice, shaky but clear, carried over the sound of wind and water. "It's coming up fast. We have to go." Outside, village public safety officers called warnings over VHF radio. The message repeated across the static. "Get to the school if you can. Bring only what you need." In some homes, the water pressed against doors before dawn. Neighbors called out through thin walls, checking who was still inside. In Kwigillingok, the power flickered and went out. Families used flashlights to wade through knee-deep water, guiding each other by voice. One survivor later described grabbing her medicine and her grandmother's coat, leaving everything else behind. By mid-morning, the current had lifted entire houses off their moorings. In Kipnuk, a row of homes drifted together, bumping and spinning on the flood. Some families waited on rooftops, waving towels or shining lights at passing boats. The VHF crackled with urgent calls, requests for help, updates on who had made it to the school, who was missing. A VPSO relayed, "We need a rescue at the Blue House. People inside. Can't get out." The relentless wind battered every structure. Metal roofs peeled away. Drying racks and outbuildings toppled into the water. In places, the river and sea became one, swallowing the old high water marks and pushing deep into the heart of each village. The tide gauge readings, 6.6 feet in Kipnuk, 6.3 in Kwigillingok, flashed on emergency radios, a stark measure of just how far the ocean had come. For many, there was no way out but up. Families huddled together, listening for the next call, waiting for help that could only come from the air or by boat. The risk was everywhere. Water laced with fuel from broken tanks, debris spinning in the current, the cold itself. Survival depended on every decision, every message sent over the radio, every neighbor's knock at the door. In Bethel, the river's rise set off a chain of problems that rippled far beyond flooded homes. As water surged through town, a fueling barge broke loose from its moorings and drifted downstream, picking up speed in the current. Crew members tried to regain control, but the wind overpowered every effort. The barge slammed into Brown's Slough Bridge, wedging itself against the pilings and blocking the main crossing. For hours, the bridge was impassable. Emergency vehicles and supply trucks backed up on both sides, unable to reach neighborhoods already cut off by water. The blockage also threatened Bethel's fuel supply, raising fears about heating and power just as temperatures began to drop. Heavy equipment operators worked through the storm, searching for a way to dislodge the barge without risking more damage or a spill. As Bethel's infrastructure strained across the delta, rescue calls multiplied. In Kipnuk and Kwigillingok, Coast Guard helicopters circled above, searching for signals from stranded families. The wind made flying dangerous. Gusts still topped 100 miles per hour in places, buffeting the aircraft as crews hovered low over rooftops and flooded yards. Rescuers lowered baskets through broken windows and onto rooftops, guiding elders and children to safety. In some homes, floodwater reached the windowsills. Survivors later described the cold, the roar of the rotors, and the moment they were lifted out, sometimes with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever they could grab in a single armful. Local search and rescue teams joined the effort, moving by boat and on foot where they could. Village public safety officers, often working without full protective gear, checked each house, calling out names and listening for replies. In the first 36 hours, at least 51 people were rescued from flooded homes in Kipnuk and Kwigillingok alone. Most were taken to the school or clinic, where volunteers handed out dry clothes and hot drinks. In the confusion, families were separated. One survivor from Kwigillingok recalled handing her baby to a stranger in a rescue boat, trusting that someone would bring them together again at the shelter. The cost of the storm was already clear. In Kwigillingok, one fatality was confirmed, and 2 people remained missing as of October 13th. The numbers shifted with each new report, but the sense of loss settled quickly. As the Coast Guard crews returned to refuel and local teams tallied the rescued, word spread that Bethel's bridge was still blocked and the fuel supply uncertain. The region's isolation, already a daily reality, now shaped every decision. With more than 1,000 people displaced and the main shelter in Bethel nearing capacity, officials faced a new challenge: how to move hundreds to safety before the next freeze. The response was no longer just local. It would soon stretch all the way to Anchorage. Within hours of the surge, Bethel's armory shelter filled to its limits. Cots lined the gym floor, families huddled under borrowed blankets, and volunteers scrambled to keep up with the steady arrival of evacuees from Kipnuk, Kwigillingok, and Napakiak. The air was thick with exhaustion and worry. Heating was patchy, water supplies stretched thin, and the first snow flurries of the season drifted against the windows. Outside, the airport runway stood as the last reliable lifeline. With roads submerged or washed out, bush planes and military transports became the only way to move people out of danger. Flight crews worked around the clock, loading manifest after manifest onto C-130s and C-17 aircraft bound for Anchorage. Each flight carried elders, children, and those in need of urgent medical care. The process was slow and tense. The runway in Bethel is short, only long enough for certain aircraft, and every takeoff had to be timed between weather fronts. There were no guarantees. If the wind shifted or ice formed, the airlift could be grounded for days. A clinician from the Yukon-Kuskokwim Health Corporation moved from cot to cot, checking blood pressure, handing out bottled water, and listening to stories of escape. Many evacuees arrived with nothing but the clothes they wore, some still soaked from the flood. The clinic's supplies dwindled as more people arrived, and staff rationed antibiotics and painkillers, mindful that resupply flights might not come soon enough. By the end of the first day, more than 300 people had been flown to Anchorage. For some, it was their first time leaving the Delta. The scale of the evacuation was unprecedented, one of the largest airlifts in Alaska's history. Yet the work was far from over. Hundreds remained in Bethel, waiting for space on the next flight, watching the weather, and hoping the runway would stay open. Winter was closing in fast, and every hour counted. In Napakiak, the village council gathers in a borrowed classroom, papers spread out across folding tables. The conversation turns from immediate repairs to the deeper questions of what comes next. Elders recall floods from decades past, but none that carried oil drums and sewage so far inland. One council member reads aloud from the latest advisory. Soil and standing water across the floodplain now test above state safety standards for petroleum and bacteria. The contamination isn't just along the riverbank. It reaches into the places families hope to rebuild. A youth planner fresh from college sketches ideas on a whiteboard, raising new homes on taller pilings, rerouting boardwalks to higher ground, mapping safe zones where soil samples cleared for children to play. The costs, though, are daunting. Elevating a single house can run into 6 figures. Managed retreat, moving the entire village to new ground, would mean leaving ancestors' graves, berry patches, and the memory of every season lived on this land. An elder's voice is quiet but steady. If we leave, who will remember where the fish run? Council minutes capture the tension. Some families want to return as soon as the ice thickens, patching floors and hoping for another year. Others, especially those with small children, worry about the health risks left behind by the flood. The local health aide reminds the group that the last round of tests found E. coli and oil residue in the water near the school. Bottled water is running low, and the next shipment depends on a clear runway and open weather. The environmental officer suggests waiting for full remediation, but winter is closing in. Across the region, similar debates unfold. State and federal disaster officials offer blueprints for elevated homes and promise funding, but the paperwork moves slowly. The council weighs every decision: how to keep families together, how to honor the land, and how to protect the next generation from what the floodwaters carried in. The choices ahead are not just about rebuilding, but about who gets to decide what safety and home will mean in the years to come. On October 12, 2025, the remnants of Typhoon Halong pushed ocean water nearly 60 miles inland, displacing more than 1,000 residents across the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. In Kipnuk and Kwigillingok, water rose over 6 feet above the highest tides, shifting homes from their foundations and forcing urgent rescues. At least 51 people were airlifted from flooded villages, in what became one of Alaska's largest emergency evacuations. 1 death was confirmed, and 2 people remained missing as of October 13th, according to Alaska public media. While the surge's reach and destruction are documented in SEOC and Ready Alaska reports, questions persist about how best to rebuild and protect these communities from future storms. The role of record-warm Pacific waters and reduced sea ice in amplifying Halong's impact is supported by Phys.org and ACAP scientists, but long-term solutions remain undecided. As families return, the evidence points to a changing climate, testing the limits of traditional life on the Delta. The aftermath of Halong's wake is clear. Recovery requires both memory and adaptation, as the region faces an uncertain coastal future.